Hello and welcome to another HanDrinksSolo wine info video. Today we're going to be talking about the Somm Pig Roussanne 2020. Now right off the bat, there's a heck of a lot to take in just on this bottle alone. I mean, there's a cartoon pig, there's a soundtrack that you can access by QR code and listen to the soundtrack while drinking the wine, and the wine itself is made up of a rather obscure cultivar, Roussanne. So to mix it up a little bit, what I'm going to do is talk about what we smell and taste in the glass, and then we'll talk about how it got there. If there's a specific piece of information that you're looking for, you can find it by clicking from chapter to chapter as they're listed in the timeline below. But first up, let's talk about what's in the glass. Well, as I've already said, this is a 100% Roussanne wine, and it's from the Breedekloof. We've spoken before about how the Breedekloof is wedged in between Wellington and Worcester, and how it's really warm there. And one of the defining characteristics of Chenin Blanc out of Breedekloof is this big, rich, generous, often quite showy fruit element. Bearing that in mind, you'd be forgiven for expecting a massive, big, rich, fruity Roussanne. But it's worth noting that this particular Roussanne is made by Attie Louw from Opstal Estate. Opstal Estate, along with Olifantsberg, are the only two estates in the entire Breedekloof to have Roussanne vines on their land. Now we add to that the fact that both Olifantsberg and Opstal Estate are two producers who regularly feature in the Platter 5-star producers lineup. And finally, we can also add to the fact that both these producers, despite producing wines out of this really warm region, somehow managed to produce wines that are concentrated but restrained. It's what wine folk might call alluringly introverted. So you get the peach, but it's white peach. It's not tinned peaches. And you might get the pineapple, but it's queen pineapple, not the weird small little yellow ones. But having implied that this wine is not popping out of its blouse doesn't mean that there isn't a whole lot going on the nose. And if you give it a sniff, there are some lovely, quite complex fruit elements going on. The notes of green pear and white peach, which I mentioned often pops up in their Chenin Blancs as well. And then there is this orange rind. And finally, to complicate it even further, there's a sort of nutty apricot kernel or green almond note. It's not like roasted nuts, but it's more like a fresh almond. So having spoken about some of the primary notes that we smell, there is more going on there. There's a whole nother layer, right? There's nutmeg and there's some cardamom. And you wonder, well, where does that all come from? Well, when you learn that this wine is barrel fermented, then it makes total sense, because you're going to get notes like cardamom or caramel or vanillin from oak. So in my mind, in this particular case, the fruit is the main show, but there is this beautiful sweet spice that kind of polishes the wine, makes it just a little sexier. It's kind of like what Scully will always be to Mulder. Now, I said it was barrel fermented. It's actually fermented in large foudres, which are really just giant oval barrels. And these are almost always going to be old oak, because winemakers use them again and again and again for decades. In fact, in Austria, some of the foudres reused there are up to 100 years old. Also, foudres have much larger volumes, so you've got a much lower ratio of oak surface to wine, and that's why the effects of lactones and vanillins are perhaps a little more subtle, allowing the beautiful fruit elements to remain front and center. And then once fermentation is done, the wine is further matured for 9 months in old oak. But let's talk about what's missing, because in other Roussanne videos that I've made recently, we've been talking about this rather pronounced kind of white pepper spice element. This spice element comes from the fact that the wine is 100% whole bunch fermented. In fact, we talked about how a whole lot of South Africa's most exciting Roussanne producers are using whole bunch almost to the exclusion of anything else. But Attie Louw has made a different call. In this wine, he only uses 20% whole bunch, so only 20% of the grapes get the stalks gone in there. The rest of the wine is destemmed and only the fruit goes in. The effect of the reduced amount of stalks is that you have a reduced amount of that spice and vegetal element. When I asked Attie why he chose to use a much lower level of stalks than perhaps some other winemakers have done, his answer was that with white wines that can often sit in the press for a little bit longer, and as they're doing that, they start to dissolve some of those tannins that are in the stalks, you can develop a rather overpowering green astringent tannic element that can be quite unattractive. So for him, the safe zone is 15 to 20%. Obviously, winemakers from other regions have had different conclusions, but this in itself is an interesting fact, because it shows just how different terroir can present different challenges to different winemakers. If you want to get maximum joy out of this particular Roussanne, I would recommend serving it alongside the Rustenburg Roussanne, especially because this is an oaked Roussanne, whereas the Rustenburg is not. Even better, serve it blind and see if you can pick the two apart. And if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the field below, or leave a review with your own thoughts on the wine. And if you're watching this on YouTube, don't forget to subscribe so that you can stay up to date with all the amazing niche cultivars, rising winemakers, and fascinating trends that are coming up in South African winelands.